Okay, put down the axes and the pitchforks, snuff out the torches, and disperse. I'm sorry. I tried. I really, really tried. I gave it 6 hours. I looked up suggestions on what I could do to enjoy it more. I changed my class. I waited until I got to a certain area. I tried. I really wanted to like this game. I really wanted to experience what everybody else was talking about. I knew it was kind of a niche game, but yeah, unfortunately, it just didn't land for me. That said, oddly enough, I'm actually kind of glad I played it. Mainly because I think I will try the sequel. But I'll try to talk more about that toward the end. So, is Dragon's Dogma worth playing in 2024? Maybe. It wasn't for me, but maybe. So Dragon's Dogma starts with you playing some more developed characters, and it attempts to kind of set up some story. After a dungeon, you'll end up switching to your character. A dragon attacks the village, and you become bound to the dragon. Honestly, that's really all I took away from the story. Oh, besides the fact that the pawns that you take with you aren't really human, they're just bound to you because of the reasons. Okay, that's everything I got from the story. As you can tell, whatever the story is here, I bounced off it pretty hard. 100% could be a me problem, we'll happily admit to that. I did read enough from even fans of the game that said the story really gets good towards the end. There's not much to it at the beginning, but yeah, for me, the story was doing nothing after 6 hours. I was not invested based on the story at all. But you know what? Fair enough. Not every game needs to have a great story, so I continued playing. Unfortunately, the world and the gameplay outside of combat are very bland. There are some enemies spread throughout the map, so as you wander from town to town, you'll occasionally encounter them. Occasionally on the road, but definitely if you wander off the road. Things like goblins, other humanoid NPCs typically, at least in the early game. At one point, as I saw an enemy up ahead, I had this split second where I thought, I wonder what that person's doing. Basically, I found myself thinking about the game as more of an MMO. And immediately after I had the thought, I kind of dismissed it. Not sure why it had occurred to me to begin with. But as I kept running and as I kept fighting enemies, I kept thinking about it. And I think the reason I had the thought is that this world feels similar to an MMO, at least in the way that it's not very deep, there's really not a lot to it, it's just a map with some enemies on it that are between you and the next town you're going to get to. They're spread apart, you'll run into one every so often, and the enemies are super basic. They don't do much, you just beat on them for a little bit and then they die. Granted, this is early game. This was in kind of one of the initial areas, and then Grand Soren after you get a little further. And I have heard that it gets more interesting, but at least in the 6 hours I played, the outdoor world feels very barren. There just doesn't seem to be a whole lot to it. But again, as I was trying to figure out what other people saw in the game, I was doing some research, and I saw a lot of people said, yep, that's also not why you play the game. It's really not about the world or that gameplay outside of combat. It really is about combat. Fair enough. I was willing to try to give it a little longer. But similarly, all of the characters, items, exploration, and the missions that I went on were all very basic. Again, from all the research I did, these aren't the reasons that people love the game, so I didn't spend too much time worrying about it, but again, I feel like calling it out because people should know what they're getting into if they try to play this game. This game is very much a product of its time. It feels like an Xbox 360 game. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. It's just the world is not all that deep or interesting. The textures around the world are pretty flat. There's not a lot to find or explore, at least not what I could find in the first few hours. It's just a very basic world. So I talked a lot about the things that didn't land for me, and honestly a lot of the things that if you go read what other fans of the game have said, they'll even say these aren't the reasons you play the game. So obviously the question is, why do people play the game? Well, there's really two things that I saw people talk about a lot. The first is the pawn system. You create one pawn after a mission in the game, you get to create one and you get to choose their appearance, choose their class, and then eventually you get to choose some more aspects about them. So this pawn stays with you throughout your game. People can also import that pawn into their game, You then have the ability to recruit 2 more pawns. These can be taken from a pool of all of the other players that played the game. You can add them to your party. You can choose them based on class or appearance or whatever criteria you want. There is some interesting stuff here. Those pawns can know some things about the quest you're going to go on. They all have different abilities. They have different attributes based on, I believe, their body type. I believe that comes into play here as well. And it's really interesting to see the pawns that other people have built. I really do think there's probably quite a bit of depth here. One thing I will say, though, is I got very sick of hearing my pawns talk. They kept repeating the same lines over and over and over again as I was going from town to town. I think I may have read that there's a way to disable that. I didn't make it that far because that was not my biggest issue with the game, but yeah, it was a little rough. It may be something that if you play the game, you may want to investigate what you can do there. So the pawn system was good, but it wasn't enough to hold me. What everyone did rave about was the combat. What I will say is I did find the combat to be interesting. Not interesting enough to keep me playing, but it was very interesting. And I should clarify, the combat was interesting with the large enemies. The small enemies, I didn't really get any enjoyment of. But occasionally, you get to fight a larger enemy. The big standout in the first part of the game would be there is a Hydra you fight. You end up chopping off one of the Hydra's heads. That's a very satisfying encounter. There's also an encounter with an ogre where you end up stabbing it in the eye. So you climb around on the back of the ogre and then you can stab it in the eye. Or the Hydra, you climb up the Hydra's neck and then you chop at it to chop its head off. Those were both very satisfying. I definitely could see why people are really attached to that part of combat, and it sounds like it gets a whole lot better. Unfortunately, those combat encounters that were interesting were just coming too far apart. I did try to switch my class at one point. I was a melee character at the start, and everybody was talking about a sorcerer, so I'm like, okay, maybe the sorcerer will be enough to keep me playing the game. I will say the magic system in this game is unique, and I think I like it better than most. You end up using stamina instead of magic. You also have the ability to kind of hold down the button and basically charge up a spell for added effect, at least on some of the spells. I really did enjoy that part. However, it just really, it wasn't enough. But there were just too many issues that I kept running into that just took me out of it. It wasn't enough to hold me. Again, I disliked kind of the lifeless world, the story, the characters. None of that was really intriguing. I found all the smaller enemies between towns to really just be an annoyance. Same with the ones that are scattered in dungeons. I found the UI to be fairly annoying to navigate. Again, sort of a product of its era. But having to do things like go into your inventory to equip a lamp and then make sure your lamp has oil, that wasn't fun at all for me. I get some people may find that immersive, but going into a menu to equip a lamp was not immersive for me in the least. Essentially, outside of the interesting pawn system and the excellent large enemy encounters, I just really wasn't enjoying my time with the game. So, why did I say maybe it's worth playing? Well, because the game has a huge following for a reason. And I saw enough in the combat to understand at least somewhat why people love this game. And there are going to be people that that's going to be enough for, because it is different than what they're going to do anywhere else. And I just can't bring myself to tell people that they shouldn't play it, because honestly, there is something special here if you can get past all of the stuff I mentioned. And you can just enjoy those large combat encounters, and that's really enough to drive the experience for you. Wonderful. You should play this game. The other reason I think this may be worth playing is actually the reason that I am not unhappy that I spent the time with it, and that's because this made me want to play the sequel. I suspect that the sequel will have less of that Xbox 360 DNA. Some of the UI elements will be improved, and then the combat will be improved further, and that could be an incredible experience. I have a feeling this could be the difference between, let's say, a Witcher 1 and 2 versus a Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 is a huge step up. As much as I actually do love The Witcher 2, it is a game that's very special to me for a few reasons. The Witcher 3 is just massively better. Not all sequels obey those rules, but I have a feeling this will be the same kind of situation. I think this will be massively better and have far more widespread appeal. I could absolutely be wrong. But again, we're not really talking about the sequel, but like I said, it is worth calling out that this may be worth playing for that same reason. It may be worth seeing, do you like the combat encounters? Because everything from the trailers for the sequel looks like it's going to be more of the same, and you may be able to get a rough idea of, do you want to play the sequel? Anyway, I think that pretty much covers Dragon's Dogma. I wanted to like it, I just couldn't. However, I am still looking forward to playing the sequel. The next Operation Backlog game is actually going to be Super Meat Boy. I had played a chunk of Super Meat Boy in the past, but I'd never finished it, and for whatever reason, I happened to see it in my Steam library and booted it up the other day. So I'm going to end up talking about that one next. But anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, maybe like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.